Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Gray Matter. Well, I'm just pleased as punch today. We have a real treat for you. Someone whom I've described and I would say is a national treasure. Imagine, if you will, someone who's about as old as Joe Biden and maybe slightly older, but is the exact opposite in terms of corpus mentis, a man with a prodigious memory, a distinguished career in Canadian politics, one of actually the last living signatory to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, someone who was intimately and directly involved in the crafting of the Charter, and in particular,
Yeah.
the vaunted, much maligned now Section 1 of the Charter, and a former premier. And to top it all off, I would say in his new prime of life, his second or third career, he's a freedom fighter, and his name is the Honourable Mr. Brian Peckford. Thanks so much for being with us again today, Brian.
Thank you, Leighton, for inviting me. I appreciate coming on your program.
Yeah. So, as we always do, we're going to start with some framing aphorisms. I know that in the past, Brian has been good enough to appear on this program twice before, and he's been somewhat delighted by these. Hopefully, we don't disappoint him today. The first one is from a poet that Mr. Peckford and I both admire very much. Although he's been dead a very long time, everything that he seemed to write about, especially in something called Areopagitica, is very, very relevant today, and his name is John Milton, who probably wrote the most important things about Jesus Christ and the Bible outside of the Bible. Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained, if you're interested. Anyway, he said this, he wrote this: "Give me the liberty to know, to utter, and to argue freely according to conscience above all liberties," a concept that is quite alien to our Canadian government today in Ottawa. Secondly, from William Penn, from roughly the same era, 1668, who wrote, "Those who will not be governed by God will be ruled by tyrants." Next, from a 20th century economist and journalist, but very much before his time, H.L. Mencken, who wrote, "The whole aim of practical politics is to keep the populace alarmed," sound familiar?
Sure.
"And hence clamorous to be led to safety by menacing it with an endless series of hobgoblins, all of them imaginary." Folks, in this context, the President Biden, who I just mentioned earlier, he's threatening to call a climate emergency. And the last one is from another author. Sadly, he passed away some years ago, with someone who Brian and I both admire very much, the late Dr. Roger Scruton, who wrote,
Uh,
"Whatever our religion and our private convictions, we are the collective inheritors of things both excellent and rare." And if there's a better description of conservatism, I haven't read it. Brian, back to you. So, for those of you who are not familiar with Brian, and you ought to be, Brian has appeared twice on this program, and what we're going to do in those previous interviews, you went into quite a bit of detail about Brian's background, and I would encourage you, if you would, to go back and read and listen to or watch those interviews, because I think that's very important to understand our guest and his worldview and where he comes from. But today, what we want to focus on are some of the things that Brian is commenting on right now, because he's not just a retired politician who's walked off into the sun. In the context of COVID-19, he's come to the fore and he's re-entered, the fray as it were, and writes one of the best blogs anywhere. And he takes on a lot of these really challenging issues that we're facing in Canada right now, particularly in the context of the tension between individual rights and freedoms and the overreach of government. And so, in that context, Brian, where I'd like to
yeah.
start is, you've written a lot about how the whole concept of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, as you understood it, being one of the participants, one of the drafters of it, has really been, in many ways, has been subverted and really perverted in the way that it's being interpreted and applied by the courts of our country and by governments in this country. So, could you start there and just give people sort of an overview of your understanding of what the charter was intended to be and why it seems to be letting us down?
Well, thanks very much, Leighton, for that introduction and explanation.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, I got really concerned back when I really should have been concerned before because some of the early decisions of the courts as it relates to the Constitution Act 1982 were ones which many of us should have highlighted at the time, like 40 years ago. Um, I did get involved back in the 90s when a number of professors wrote articles about how the Constitution Act came together and pointed out the error of their ways, trying to indicate that this was a sort of a plot organized by the Prime Minister Trudeau Sr. and some of his mandarins, and that us premiers had very little to do with it. And so my concern with the Constitution development and the Constitution Act 1982 really stems back to those early days. And even when we were negotiating it, people may forget that it was the Prime Minister at the time when we were trying to negotiate patriation, which meant we bring the Constitution back to Canada and add to it the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, that he actually left the table and
This is a
sabotaged our
story that's seldom
negotiation.
told, isn't it? Yeah, this is a great
It's
story.
never told. And when I do tell it, um, many people, even in the audiences, uh, try to gloss over it in their questions afterwards, or don't even ask a question about it, and they had never heard of it before. And because his the way we were approaching the Constitution was as full participants in the 1867 Constitution Act, which had certain powers with the provinces and certain powers with the federal government. And as we began to negotiate with the Prime Minister at the time, he was beginning to leverage that we were really just like municipalities and not provinces under the constitutions. And therefore, what the federal government would say at the end of the day would be what would go. When we began to remind him of the Constitution on which we were then operating, and he really couldn't do this, he got very upset to the point of leaving the table.
Seems to be a
So
genetic problem with
it seems to be a genetic problem. How true? Yeah, no question. So the whole point was not only uh, did we have to forge something that protected the powers of the provinces as well as the government of Canada, but also put that clearly in any new document we were going to produce.
right.
And to that end, when we got involved, not only with bringing the Constitution home and an amending formula, because there was no point of bringing the Constitution home if we had no way to change it. It wouldn't work. And 10 times had been tried since the 1920s to the 1980s to do this, and it always failed, primarily over the whole question of an amending formula. How are we going to change it in the future if we have to change it ourselves? Oh my gosh, I suddenly got something great in my hands. We can actually change our own constitution. Well, now, how do we do that? And so there were many elements to this process of 1981-82, 17 months, by the way, of talks between the provinces and the federal government to patriate and have a Charter of Rights and Freedoms. But a core part of that, as we move through the system, and as at the time, many commentators were talking about the Charter and that it was really just the Prime Minister who really wanted a Charter, when that was not at all true. What we wanted was a Charter that would work and an amending form that would work, and a Charter that protected provincial rights as well as individual rights. And as we got more and more into it, the premiers were very, very insistent, not only on the provincial power part of it, but also the individual right parts. And this has really gotten lost and never written about all that much. And so when it came down to, for example, as you referred to, Section 1 of the Charter, which has been greatly maligned in my view, there was a great argument that we had in there at the time, the word justify, before you could suspend any individual rights that were going to come later in the Charter. We argued over, and myself and Peter Lougheed, Sterling Lyon of Manitoba, Bill Bennett of British Columbia in particular, and Angus MacLean of PEI, we argued we needed to strengthen that. Justify sounds great, it's a great word. And that's how demonstrably justify got put in there, is because we insisted upon it, because we were getting really, really concerned that if we really were going to do something about freedom of speech, freedom of press, assembly, all the major freedoms and rights, then we should make sure that any breach of these or any chance of governments being able to temporarily suspend them for emergency purposes, that they must at the same time demonstrably demonstrate this.
So you actually foresaw that something like that happening at the time, Brian. That was
exactly.
Interesting.
And that was primarily because we were concerned about the way that the federal government had gone about this process in the beginning, leaving the table.
Right.
And we took the federal government to court. And at the end of the day, the federal government, because of opposition from us and others, decided to do a reference to the Supreme Court. And so all of the cases got combined together.
That's another story that's not told very often, is it? About that court challenge.
Exactly.
That's lost in the mists of history, unfortunately.
September, right?
Yeah.
September 1981, and where the court ruled that what the Prime Minister was trying to do, and leaving the table and doing his own patriation and his own charter, was unconstitutional. And therefore, he was forced back to the table. The Premiers weren't forced back to the table. We were already at the table. It was he who left. But to come back to your main point that you were making, because I get very excited about this business of that particular court case, and how it's not been interpreted historically properly, but also not being interpreted properly is the province's concern with individual rights, and why we wanted to insist upon strengthening justify, so that it was demonstrably justified. Many lawyers today and many courts today ignore demonstrably justify and talk about reasonable, about the word reason in Section 1. But it's within the reasonable framework one must consider that you still must demonstrably justify what you're doing before you satisfy the terms of that Section 1.
Right.
And so it was the provinces who insisted upon this business of ensuring that these rights and freedoms that we were about to enunciate and that we were negotiating were actually going to be there when crucial times came in our history, like during the truckers' convoy. So, and once again, many people don't historically even recognize the big role that people like Angus MacLean of PEI, the farmer, the blueberry farmer of PEI, former Veterans Affairs Minister for John Diefenbaker, and a veteran himself. I knew Mr. MacLean and his wife very, very well. And what a strong person for Canada and for the Charter. And of course, Sterling Lyon of Manitoba, who's hardly ever mentioned, very, very strong, as was Peter Lougheed and Bill Bennett and Angus and Alan Blakeney of Saskatchewan. These were really the strong First Ministers who strongly supported this demonstrably justify part of Section 1. We just thought at the time then that it was quite... and then, of course, the other part that people ignore, some lawyers and many so-called legal experts call it the preamble. I don't call it the preamble. We did not call it the preamble. It's the first part of the charter.
of the
It's
charter.
in the charter. It's not something that comes before the charter, because when you say preamble, usually something that comes before, and it could easily be interpreted that
Yeah.
was outside the
It's the
actual
courts that really
purpose
gave it
of the
that name,
charter.
isn't it? And that's part of the problem.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so I remember the debates about that, as well as about justice. I remember them extremely well. And we were all, Levesque included at the time, we were all, there was not one first minister who debated or questioned about putting in the supremacy of God.
Mm-hmm.
Not one.
No.
Of course, as we were all Christians at the time, so it was self-evident to us that the God that we were talking about was a Judeo-Christian God, because we knew no other.
Right.
Could it be any other God if we knew no other? I mean, come on. So that was extremely important to begin the charter.
Mm-hmm.
Supremacy of God, rule of law, demonstrably justified.
Mm-hmm.
And as we got into this thing, Leighton, during the truckers' convoy, and some of us started to speak out and take actions like you have done for different people and organizations on the charter, these conversations haunted me, because they came back. They came back to me in spades.
Mm-hmm.
Um, as we did, like some of the historical accounts of the process of the Constitution, where people
Right.
said, Levesque, you left Levesque out, you left Quebec out. Well, it just
Right.
so happened that night we put it together, he wasn't there. We looked for him. He wasn't in his room. Neither was the Quebec delegation. They were across the river in Hull having a late supper, the delegation. But nobody knew where they were. Nobody knew they were in Hull, because all of them were gone. My minister at the time was since passed away, Gerald Anheimer, actually went to their suite door, knocked on the door, trying to find them. So, but by the same token, the next morning, when we finalized that proposal to go to all the first ministers, Levesque was there, and the Quebec delegation, and they had an opportunity to look at what we had put together overnight. And as Premier Lougheed and others have related in telling the story about that time. So in the same way as the issue of Levesque haunts me, because I know the difference,
Yeah.
so does this business of the supremacy of God and the demonstrably justified. So I think those two examples demonstrate the importance that the premiers put on the charter. And
Brian,
it wasn't just on the provincial power part of the Constitution.
can I ask you a couple of questions about the spirit of those meetings at that time? And two things in particular I'm curious about. Number one, was there a concern around the table with the first ministers, let's say excluding Trudeau, that the charter could be used as a means of expanding or creating rights? I'm talking about the judiciary now, in the way that we've begun to see this, or we have seen this unfold over the past 40 years. That's number one. And secondly, we now live in a country where we haven't had a first ministers conference in 8 years. And we have a prime minister who says, I think he said recently, that if the premiers didn't do what he said, he would just go around them for the benefit of Canadians. This is really frightening.
Yes.
It's a frightening, really complete misunderstanding of what Canada is constitutionally. But my question is, was government overreach, federal government overreach, as much of a problem back then? So it's kind of a two-parter. Were you concerned about what the judiciary would do with the charter? And secondly, was federal government overreach, in other words, the federal government behaving like a national government, which it's not, was that something that was of concern around the table when you were going through these meetings?
I'm glad you asked it. Very few people ask the question you ask, which is very complimentary of you, but very sad about
It's because I want to know.
Out of the, well, exactly. I wish more would want to know. uh, Look, very early on, Sterling Lyon, René Levesque, Peter Lougheed, myself, and some of the delegation in British Columbia were extremely concerned. And when Trudeau left the table halfway through the negotiations, they said, "We told you so." Because even myself at the time did not believe that he would leave the table, that he would argue, fight hard through Chrétien and through some of these other mandarins. They would, be putting forward things that we're going to have to negotiate out, but never to the point of leaving the table. Now, Levesque had said that.
Mr. Levesque gets a lot of the blame, though. It gets shunted off onto him, but actually you're saying it was actually Mr. Trudeau who is the problem at the table.
Absolutely. That wasn't Mr. Levesque at all.
Fascinating.
Until near the end there. But remember, he had two very strong ministers, Levesque did. Claude Morin was one, and Jacques Parizeau was the other. They were there. Very strong personalities, highly cultured, learned individuals, not only in the broader sense, but in the narrower sense of Quebec's place in Canada, and all of the jurisprudence that goes with that. Very, very qualified, interesting individuals, as was Levesque himself. So yes, there was a real concern about federal overreach because we began to see it. And then when Trudeau left the table, we saw it. That's why these demonstrably justify and supremacy of God things became so important at the end of the day.
Right.
Because of that. But to take it one step further, to perhaps help people understand, even at the last few days, various delegations were bringing up what you just mentioned, that later the judicial overreach.
Right.
And in almost every case, except Levesque, there were, what shall I call them, advisors, not only provincial bureaucrats, but advisors that we had brought in to assist us in negotiating, who reassured us that this wouldn't happen. And at the end of the day, any further concerns about that were sort of put one side. No, you're overreacting. You're being too, right? And the desire to not fail, right? Any additional concerns. And I think having achieved what we did achieve and forced Trudeau back to the table, perhaps also weakened our resolve, even though it was raised, right? In the last few days, it was definitely raised. And a lot of us still had concerns. I did in particular. Sterling Lyon was by far the star in this argument of federal overreach and later judicial activism and so on. Sterling Lyon was the star in that, and he does not get enough credit on that score. But Levesque's people were too, of course. They would be right on top of that, right? And were all through the piece.